Haua. Ishtakulun la is the singing la. Irashputsle ka daldias handir kriyaga di gadias kriyawaga. Good morning, good friends. My Haida names are Girashputsle and Gadaldias. I'm a member of the Ravens, and I'm very happy to be here today. I want to begin by thanking the Silla Week team, but especially, we've met them earlier, but especially those that I've dealt with. Darlene Brown, Jack Lau, Paula Brunel, and Rathas Raymond Ryland. Thank you very much for helping steer me to this presentation today. I'd like to thank Marina LaSalle and Nigel Baker-Grenier from my law firm for providing research support for me. I really want to thank Gwaganat Diane Brown, the Haida Kil Ginaskafa Ilgai, along my Haida language teacher. Any mistakes, though, in the pronunciation are mine. Robert Oatsanglans, my teacher and mentor, and many others, including my parents. Kinang April Churchill, Skill, Haklas, Enbridge-Davidson, Gujao, many people who helped set me on the path today. Kiltla Glu Gamgina Koya, Gamhano Jiha Digi Subangina. Jiha used to tell me that there is nothing more precious than saying thank you. Now I'm going to talk about 4 areas. None of these are interrelated. Colonization and the climate crisis, UNDRIP, Haida Law and Aboriginal law, and self-determination and energy sovereignty. I will speak only briefly about Aboriginal law because it is Canadian law about Indigenous peoples. It is not our laws, but we need to consider it in all the work that we do. I begin with this slide because I will be covering some dark topics. They may be hard to hear. They may sound like doom and gloom, but I ask that you stay with me. We really do have to hear the darkness before we can move into the light. My PowerPoint will be filled with images and set of text slides for this reason. It includes mostly the art of Oatsanglans, Eagle of the Dawn, Robert Davidson. So I hope that they will help illustrate the points that I make. We heard about the Haida Nation case. You've heard that it is the leading case on consultation and accommodation in Canada. The court considered the honor of the Crown and recognized and affirmed the necessity of the Crown, provincial and federal governments to safeguard potential rights that are protected under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. Our case has been applied and affirmed in many, many cases in Canada, including in areas of treaty areas. This is an image of the Haida people some of the Haida people who attended the court that day. Until our case, only consultation was required. As a result of our case, accommodation may be required when Aboriginal rights might be infringed, or when a litigation case is strong. In other words, where the evidence is really strong to support Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal title. This area of law is often called the duty to consult and accommodate. But yet, this area of law, even when accommodation is required, can only take us so far towards meeting the goals of the Haida Nation. More is needed, and therefore the Council of the Haida Nation is pursuing recognition of Aboriginal title through litigation and through a negotiated agreement. Litigation and negotiated agreements in Canada have mostly been reactionary. They usually are in response to Indigenous peoples challenging developments, proposed developments. The most successful agreements come from litigation, such as that brought by the Blueberry River First Nations in northeast British Columbia. Here the court held that the Crown had infringed their rights. The outcome was an agreement that provided $65 million of funding for restoration, restricted oil and gas, shared decision-making, and co-management. The significance of this case is that the court found a positive duty to assess the cumulative effects of development. So the map on the right shows the extent of development in that nation's territory. You can't see the land for all of the development throughout their territory, and the court considered that, and that's something that often doesn't happen in Canadian Aboriginal law. As for other negotiated agreements in energy law, NWP Coal Canada and the Tobacco Plains Indian Band reached a deal that would give that First Nation the power to act as a regulator and reviewer of the proposed Crown Mountain coal mine near Elk Ford, BC. The Elk Valley region in British Columbia is home to several coal mines and proposed developments. So this is a really high mark in that the parties agreed to implement consent. Consent was required if the nation is moving along and at some point they say, you know what, we thought we were going to do this coal mine, but we changed our mind and we're not going to do it. And the company agreed to that. So that's unheard of in other agreements thus far. And of course, we know about the Haida Nation's agreements. We've negotiated collaborative decision-making agreements that are considered the high water mark in Canadian Aboriginal law. As these cases have gone through the courts, and while the Haida Nation has been slowly building our title case, the legal landscape has been steadily shifting and transforming towards recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and laws, not only in Canada, but internationally as well. This transforming landscape has implications for the practice of law, climate law, and energy law, and so I'll speak briefly about these transformative changes. You've all heard about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's often called UNDRIP. It was passed by a majority of states 16 years ago in 2007. An interesting fact, did you know that Canada was one of 4 states who voted against UNDRIP when it was proceeding through? Of course, they changed their position, but that is telling. Many of you have heard about UNDRIP, and there's a lot I can say about it, but the main thing you need to know is that UNDRIP recognizes the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. UNDRIP outlines a way for nation-states that have colonized Indigenous lands to redress past and present injustices based on the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. None of the provisions of UNDRIP deal directly or explicitly with energy law. However, several of the articles concern lands and resources and development projects more generally, and would therefore apply as we consider our path forward in pursuing green energy. Article 26.1 affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional lands, territories, and resources. Article 28.1 affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to redress, restitution, or fair compensation for the lands, territories, and resources that were taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Here in Haida Gwaii, that's billions of dollars. Article 29.1, Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands and territories. Article 32.1, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop their own priorities and strategies for the development and the care of their lands and territories. And finally, Article 32.2, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerning their own representative institutions to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent prior to approving any projects affecting their lands or territories and other resources. In 2019, the province of British Columbia adopted UNDRIP through legislation, and the federal government followed in 2021. Critical to both of these governments adopting legislation in relation to UNDRIP was the groundwork done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. The TRC released its executive summary report with 94 calls to action that every single Canadian must have read and understood and be actively working to implement. These calls to action were to redress the legacy of residential schools and to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. TRC Call to Action 47 called upon the repudiation of the concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples in our lands, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to reform the laws of this country and our policies and our litigation strategies to ensure that for those that rely upon these two concepts. For those of you who are not familiar with these terms, the doctrine of discovery was the international law that gave explorers the right to claim vacant land, they called it, land that was not occupied by Christians. Terra nullius is the Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one, or empty land. This doctrine was repudiated in the 2004 Chief Coteen case, but even though these concepts have been repudiated, not much has changed on the ground as we know. There are many unsettled issues in litigation and negotiation across Canada. The provincial and federal governments, this is because the provincial and federal governments view UNDRIP as aspirational, meaning it's something that will be achieved in the future as they start implementing their action plan. As such, they say it is not legally binding. The Haida Nation is calling BC out on this position in litigation that they launched to challenge the entire mining regime of British Columbia. It will be heard in the BC Supreme Court in early April. It would be unfortunate, and I would say disrespectful to the honor of the Crown, if the case was only decided on consultation and accommodation. It could be the first case to determine the extent to which UNDRIP applies and is binding on British Columbia and Canada. Many Indigenous scholars, such as John Burroughs, Joshua Nichols, Sarah Morales, Robert Hamilton, and others, have critiqued the balancing that occurs with Section 35 litigation. This is the approach taken with charter rights, where you're trying to balance different interests and arrive at a solution. And it doesn't work because our rights have never been part of that balancing, because our rights have not been properly accommodated. And they call for the application of a new framework that recognizes the jurisdiction and laws of Indigenous peoples. This was the argument that the Haida Nation made when we intervened at the Supreme Court of Canada in BC's reference case, when they were trying to pass the Environmental Management Act to protect BC, so-called BC lands, our lands, in response to a pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. There is obviously still work to do. We have to bushwhack through these myths like terra nullius that underlie industrial society. Terra nullius is a myth. It is a legal fiction. We know from the ship elders that gum kilgu kilgai aspihakanga, meaning there is no land strange. There is no land lying vacant in Haida Gwaii. There are many other myths that have created the law that we know it in Canada, and many have written about them. I like calling them mythical narratives because as Haida people, we've heard our original instructions, our origin stories, our narratives called myths. These myths have been spun into global myths, including the idea that the world's resources are unlimited and that the industrial society is advanced because of wealth and power accumulation. Yet, oil geologist Dr. Hubbard warned in the 1950s that the maximum amount of oil would be taken in 1970. Many analysts agree that the global peak oil, the maximum amount of oil that could be extracted in one day, occurred between 2005 and 2008. The oil remaining now will be harder to get and more costly to extract. Dakota scholar Waziyatawin, among many others, have explained about how cheap fossil fuels have allowed massive population growth around the world, and as a result, unprecedented carbon dioxide emissions. Now, it might be easy for us here on beautiful Haida Gwaii to think that this is a problem far away from us, and that we don't have to worry about it. But oil and petroleum products are all around us. They're in bicycle tires, one of the solutions we talked about. They're in car bodies, they're in garbage bags, nylon rope, house paint, water pipes, ice chests, telephones, cameras, computers, fan belts, golf balls, dishwasher parts, refrigerators, refrigerants, guitar strings, shower curtains, toothbrushes, nail polish, hair curlers, pantyhose, lipstick, rubbing alcohol, insect repellent, fertilizers, hand lotion, bandages, glasses, contact lenses, shaving cream, vitamin capsules, dentures, clothing, heart valves, and many, many other things. We just cannot escape petroleum in the plastic products around us. Many of these things are disposable. Our ocean relatives are choking in plastics. All are made from these petroleum products. This is Kalgathanawajat, plastic woman, who was made from plastics found in the low tide area around Vancouver Island. A similar version of her appeared at the Bill Reid Gallery. This is my installation piece, made from plastic that I found in Guayhanas. It was heartbreaking to see the extent of the plastics that we generate every single day, that I generate every single day. Much of industrial society has evolved as if nothing has a connection. This image that Robert created is entitled No Connection. It reflects upon the lack of connection between the big corporations, scientists, and government, and the environment. That is the root of the problem that has grounded industrial society. But we know that everything is connected here on Haida Gwaii. We have a beautiful proverb that our elders have told us. It is Kilgat Aiskuchans Paupang Ega Gam Aganda Kyange Langang Yin Westagan Kilwi Baska. The world is as sharp as the edge of a knife, and if you are not careful, you will fall off. In the context of what we're speaking about today, every aspect of our lives will be affected by rising oil prices. And then the collapse of the oil economy, the end of the world as we know it. Our lives won't end, but the lifestyle that we have become accustomed to will end. We thought all of these beautiful ideas that we'll talk about will only delay that inevitable. We can come up with solar energy, we can come up with all these green energy choices, but it's delaying that eventual collapse because there are just too many people on the earth and not enough oil to sustain the life cycle that we've developed in the last century. The unsustainable growth has meant the depletion of the beings, our relatives in the Haida worldview, that are contained in fresh water, in salt water, and in the forests. Globally, we are facing an existential threat. Our own existence is threatened. Because of the losses to biodiversity from human activities that have taken from the land, from the waters, from the air above us, and all of that has exacerbated global warming. The Supreme Court of Canada, even Canada's own court, has recognized that climate change, I quote, is a threat of the highest order to the country and indeed to the world. The charity Accounting for Sustainability has reported that 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. And there has been a 60% decline in mammals, birds, fish, and amphibians, those that cross both realms, since 1970. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has reported that in the 5 years from 2010 to 2015, natural forests declined by 6.5 million acres per year, an area larger than the size of the United Kingdom. According to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, over 90% of the world's marine stocks are fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. That's so scary to us as an island people who survive on the oceans. Recently, Justice McLaughlin, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, said for the Lawyers for Climate Change, "Dealing with climate change is among the most important challenges that will face Canada and the world in the 21st century. The impact of climate change will be especially felt by already vulnerable people, exacerbating the social and legal difficulties they face." I also spoke in favor of Lawyers for Climate Change and said that climate change is the next wave of colonization. Climate change threatens to steal the existence of Indigenous peoples and our rights, making Canada's commitment to reconciliation unattainable. So there's a whole bunch of terminology used to legitimate these mythical narratives. Cherokee scholar Jeff Corntassel has looked at what these phrases mean to Indigenous peoples, not just how we normally see it in today's society. And from our perspective, he says that these phrases that we throw about hide larger truths. Some of them are state building. Well, from Indigenous peoples' perspective, state building is Indigenous nation destroying. Economic development is land theft and the plunder of Indigenous homelands and resources through extractive industries. Reconciliation is using a state process to legitimize continuing colonial occupation of Indigenous homelands. Protest. We know that. That's protecting Indigenous homelands. That's protecting Haida Gwaii. Assimilation is genocide from our perspective, Indigenous perspectives. Separatists is a nation that never joined the state. When I first went to university, I thought I'd take a social sciences course, and we had to fill out a little survey at the beginning of the class. And they asked, how do we identify? And they said, for example, you might be Chinese Canadian, you might be, and they gave these examples, and I thought, well, I'm Haida. I'm not Canadian, I'm Haida. And so he came back the next day and he summarized the results and he said, and we have one Western separatist in this room. Well, I dropped that course. I didn't have it. All of these terms demonstrate that colonialism is an ongoing process. That means we must continue to decolonize. The importance of Haida terminology cannot also be emphasized enough, and I know that that was spoken about in the last Energy Symposium. There are deep insights into the right conduct contained in Haida Kill and Hot Kill. Lately, I've really been intrigued by Sanghees and Hidatsa scholar Michael Yellowbird. He has studied the impacts of colonization on Indigenous peoples. Robert and I heard him speak on CBC radio and how he faced discrimination and trauma while attending university. So he started meditating to deal with stress and the trauma he faced there. And from there, he began to study the physical impacts of meditation on human brains. He found that mindfulness can actually reprogram one's brain and he began advocating for what he called neurodecolonization, meaning decolonizing our minds. He, along with a chorus of other scholars, began looking carefully at how colonialism has infiltrated our minds and we're not aware of it. He said that we need peaceful, intelligent, courageous challenges to existing institutions of colonialism and to question our own complicity in those institutions. He writes that we can transform our neural networks, all the networks in our brain, the things connecting our brain together, in positive ways that will provide us with the resources we need to overcome the oppression of colonialism. The latest neuroscience research teaches that we can improve our mental and physical well-being by shedding unconstructive, negative thinking, feelings, and behaviors. We can actually strengthen our neural pathways in our brain. We have the power to limit or reverse the negative effects of past trauma and harms through consistent mindfulness practice and create positive change in our lives. Now this is an image of Haida Gwaii, half rock woman. She appears throughout the oral narratives. She's grounded, calm, she observes, and she respectfully witnesses events as they unfold. She often provides advice for how to get out of captive situations. She practiced mindfulness. She had to. She was rooted in one place for her entire existence. And so that's an example of where we've practiced mindfulness, where mindfulness appears in the Raven traveling stories. Personally, I have a hard time meditating. I'm trying. But the exciting part of his research is that this is not New Age. This is not just Buddhism. This is not Taoism, all of those things. This is old age. Mindfulness doesn't come from another culture. It comes from Haida culture. Mindfulness is part of traditional and contemporary Indigenous and Haida ceremonies. When we sing and dance in potlatches, we enter a state of mindfulness. We experienced this when we led all the dance groups at Celebration in Juneau and sang for 2 hours straight without a break, and we sang in more than 2,000 dancers. Our song became a mantra as we watched the dancers come in and off the stage. Our spirits were strengthened and our minds were relieved. Now, we don't have to sing for 2 hours to experience that mindfulness. When our elders pray, like Waganat did this morning, they must focus so intensely on the matter at hand. In all such cases, our attention is focused. We don't worry about the many things we must face in our daily lives, but we're focused on that matter, and we're helping, once we do a regular practice of that, to strengthen our brain. Decolonization is not passive. It involves reflection, critical reflection and action upon the world, what Brazilian scholar Paulo Freire called praxis. This is something we have done with asserting our rights entitled to Haida Gwaii through some of the examples you heard earlier, upholding Haida Law at Haida Gwaii, through ICSI, through Enough is Enough, land and marine use planning, the current negotiations, the Haida title case, herring litigation. All of this is a work in progress, but it's important to keep in mind what many scholars have written, that self-determination is asserted. It is not negotiated, it is not litigated. Every single one of us has a role to play in the self-determination of us here on Haida Gwaii. Tying back to mindfulness, what you think you become is what the Buddha said. We have a famous expression, make your mind strong. That means that whatever you think about, you can achieve if you have a good heart and you set out to achieve that. We all hold the power to change and transform Haida Gwaii. Wazia Tawen, the Dakota scholar that I talked about earlier, has developed a 7-point action plan for responding to economic, ecological, and fossil fuel collapse. Her plan, as well as many other Indigenous scholars, encourages a return to our spiritual and cultural foundations. This foundation is often contained in original instructions, like we heard about from Waganat this morning, about how we sit down and think through how we are going to live on the land and sea. It requires reflection on where we came from and how to build upon that foundation, as illustrated in this image, Robert's image, looking back at where we came from. It includes a reflection. It's looking back and it's looking forward and it's multiplying. Our original instructions are also contained in the Raven Traveling series, which explains how this physical world as we know it has come to be. We all know the nature of Raven. She, he, just cannot help but want. Eat. More raven feathers, more bling. We just can't control ourselves. Our ancestors were teaching us about greed and the dangers of it when they shared these narratives about Raven and the crazy things that Raven did in the Raven traveling stories. Waziyatawan encourages a return to live the meaning of indigeneity, or in our case, to live the meaning of Haida-aity. Many scholars have encouraged place-based activities. The Haida Nation has done that work, and we're beginning that work again in the Haida Laws project. This image shows spruce root gathering trip that we did to Grey Bay this past summer. I applaud the work of Chuck Clow, Paula Varnell, and her upcoming project with Swillowee and the Haida Gwaii Museum to make functional food gathering baskets to bring us back out on the land, to be using our materials instead of plastic buckets and all the things that we've become accustomed to. What better way to literally weave place-based activities into daily lives? New Charnock and Tsimshian scholar Cliff Atleo Jr. is another of many scholars who are encouraging a return to place-based activities. Many Indigenous peoples live away from our homeland, the Haida included. And those that remain are participating in less of the things our grandparents and grandparents used to do, even if they're adoptive or mixed activities such as commercial fishing. There are far fewer commercial fishermen left in our communities. And that takes us one step away from the land. While many of us feed ourselves from our territories, how long could we survive in Haida Gwaii without supplies? Cliffat Leo wrote that Vancouver Island has only 3 days of supplies at any given time. He says that that's especially significant for an island, and especially for an island near major fault lines, which of course is Haida Gwaii as well. Another element of Waziyatawan's plan, as well as many other scholars, include building lifeboats of supplies, such as food, clean water, materials, and skills to effectively store our food and our water. For now, I'll call this building canoe journeys, but we need to find a Haida-appropriate word for this. Robert Davidson has also shared with me his insight that when our ancestors prepared to cross Hecate Strait in our canoes, they needed to prepare on 3 levels: the spiritual level, the mental level, which means visualizing the destination of where we're going, and the physical level. So we need to also prepare on those levels as we look at this global climate crisis and examine how long can we survive on this island without supplies. We have a responsibility to honor and celebrate young warriors, people who practice physical strengthening, male and female, those who are disciplined, those who practice self-sufficiency, those who practice sustainable living, and service to the people in our homelands. I can think of one person, Desi Collinson, who does this. We need to uphold the work that he does. There are many others. It is the youth, we've heard this so many times, who will lead our struggle, but it will be through the hardest part of our journey as a nation. We have a responsibility as parents, as aunts, as uncles, as grandparents, as older siblings, to help set the youth on the right path, to prepare them for the challenges that are ahead of us, to prepare them from potentially not having supplies to Haida Gwaii. We can transform our educational system to include more land-based educational alternatives. We need to get back and feel that connection with the land and sea. Robert entitled this image, Children of the Good People, which, as you know, the Council of the Haida Nation adopted as its logo and national flag. When we meet the responsibilities as parents, as aunties, as uncles, as grandparents, as good neighbors, we are becoming good people. We are becoming people who are following the teachings of our ancestors. One way is through providing new tools to education, such as this book, Magical Beings. This is an illustration from the book Magical Beings, Coloring and Activity Book, that was written with Judd Plow, Paula Burnell, and Sarah Florence-Davidson. This book contains activities for children to get out and explore what the supernatural beings mean, what they look like, and more importantly, getting them outside to actually have that on-the-ground experience of the supernatural beings. One of the most significant well springs, one of the most significant sources of Haida laws, is an intimate and long relationship with Haida Gwaii. We hear that so often, it's like a mantra. That means for us, in looking at Haida laws, that it is the land, the sea, and the beings of the land and sea that are our primary sources of Haida laws. This is a visual representation of my Master of Laws thesis called Lalaxaaygans, Cedar Sisters Framework. It is a framework for the analysis of Haida laws that is based on the cedar tree. It draws upon the central role of cedar to Haida culture and some of the unique attributes of the cedar tree. Miraculously, they aligned with the laws that the Haida Nation has developed and that you heard about earlier. The CHN has identified those principles, which are really laws, for use in our marine use planning and our governance and our negotiations with Canada and BC. Many of us know these laws, I won't repeat them. The CHN is a leader in drawing upon Haida laws to shape policy, to name a few. Our own constitution from 2003, our Haida land use vision, Haida Gwaii, respecting Haida Gwaii, in 2005, Haida ethics and values in 2007, Haida healthy Haidas, the Land Sea People Plan of 2018, the Haida Gwaii Marine Plan in 2015, the Seamount Management Plan of 2019. The Cedar Sisters Framework adds one more law, and this is the laws of gender and authority and working together, which are represented by the seeds of the cedar tree. Many female Indigenous scholars, such as Leanne Simpson, Sarah Hunt, and Emily Snyder, to name a few, have advocated for a discussion of women's roles as a result of colonial patriarchy, formal governance with mostly male leaders, gendered colonialism, and the gendered dispossession of territories and the minds, bodies, and experiences of children, women, and the full expression and full spectrum of gender expression. Now, we don't have time today to fully cover these categories of Haida laws. That is a project that the Haida Nation is just embarking upon. For now, I'll say that Haida laws are not only reflected in our territory, as we heard this morning, they're not just in the land, the water, the undersea realms, and the air realms, but they are reflected in our culture. They are contained in our ceremonies, in how we view the world, in our language, in our territory, and in our stories. They have significance for energy sovereignty in Haida Gwaii. As advocated by Wazi Atawin, they will shape our responses to current and future threats to Haida Gwaii as we develop our solutions to this energy problem. Daniel Wildcat, in his book Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge, also talked about this and said that sovereignty, self-determination, economic development, and even democracy itself are meaningless unless they explicitly relate to the climate crisis that we are observing. In other conferences, I have emphasized that Indigenous communities are in a unique position to address climate change. because of our sovereignty. Chippewan Cree scholar Alan Parker has written that Indigenous peoples can develop our own models of dealing with climate change and managing nature in a sustainable way. Self-sufficiency is at the heart of his plan, which is why I've included this image entitled Rock Scallops, where Robert depicts the gathering of rock scallops in abalone with sugar and with the late Sugar Collinson and with the late Chief Dempsey Collinson down in Waihanas. Alan Parker outlined 10 recommendations for Indigenous peoples to build resilience in their communities, which I'll paraphrase quickly here. First, gather information about the impacts of climate change in your region and make it available to your community. Second, secure sources of water. It wasn't too long ago that Robert told me that the village of Masset experienced drought until we had water infrastructure. We may not be able to rely upon water infrastructure in the future. Secure sources of food. 4, provide for impacts on plant and animal species. We could depend upon something now, but with climate change impacting those animals, they may not be available for us. 5, and this is something we do great at, and I'm so happy to see our communities, all the communities here, develop relationships with neighboring governments and communities regarding disaster planning. We certainly had, were able to practice that during the pandemic and the coast-wide response that we worked on. Consider political alliances. 6, consider political alliances to build a renewable energy policy, which is the work we're doing. 7, consider strategies to unite Indigenous peoples around the protection needed to defend our rights. 8, consider active involvement as sovereign Indigenous governments in global climate change negotiations. They also will impact our work. 8, get youth, and I should say I'm really proud of Hannah for participating in those discussions at the UN. Get youth involved in cultural education and defending the future of our nation. 10, work with Indigenous nations across imposed colonial boundaries according to natural regions such as the Northwest Coast, into Alaska with our relatives there. This is what we're doing through ICE, and you'll hear about it tomorrow from Leona Humpchip. The trend of Indigenous engagement in the renewable energy sector has followed the transformation of Aboriginal law that I spoke about earlier. We've gone from being ignored to receiving token or minimal consultation to becoming increasingly acknowledged as legitimate stakeholders in negotiations, to being involved, other nations are in benefit agreements, to becoming partners in revenue sharing agreements, to being recognized as authorities where consent is a requirement in anything that happens on our territories, and to being full and part owners of energy development corporations, as long as they don't infringe our Haida laws, of course. Central to these changes is formal recognition of UN-affirmed Indigenous peoples' rights through the BC and federal legislation. Professor Christina Hoika at UVic has written that the most profound change to support reconciliation would be the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent that would allow Indigenous communities control over all resource development projects, including renewable energy. Indigenous energy projects are fundamentally about Indigenous sovereignty. Literally, we're taking back power. Indigenous energy projects focus on community wellness, protection of heritage, preservation of ecological health, protection, and the best renewable energy projects support building community capacity and fostering Indigenous youth mentoring and leadership, as we are doing here today. We are in a state of change. We are on the eve of the largest transformation in the world's history. Others in the legal profession envy our position as Indigenous peoples. We have an opportunity to identify our laws in a way that will secure our future. This is not something that Canadians have had as a privilege. We have that privilege. This piece, Robert's piece, is entitled A Thin Line, and it explores the thin line connecting us to our ancestral past. It also explores what it means to be Haida art. Like the art, we have the power to rewrite the idea of who we are and what our future will hold. As Haida people, this we know. When we look at the Haida worldview and Haida laws from the forest, ocean, and human realms, we know that the land and the sea are interrelated and interdependent. We know that we need a holistic and integrated approach to managing humans' use of the land and sea. And we know that we need to protect cultural species for our health and well-being. Haida laws are the foundation to achieve Haida sovereignty. It's Nangkina Yuan's James Young said that these were the teachers of language and survival. They had supernatural powers, and their purpose was to populate Haida Gwaii. Real people came from those people. This image echoes from the supernatural can help guide us, and I quote Robert as he describes this piece. Echoes of the supernatural is about digging in the cosmic bank, the creations that we will bring to life, but they're also echoes of the work or ideas of past generations. It is like turning on the radio and trying to tune through the static to a certain channel or seeking one within that section. Because he's learned the vocabulary of Northwest Coast art, his art and his images come out that way by tuning into that channel. The images in the central circle are eagle and wolf crests. They represent interactions with the natural and supernatural worlds. The line where the white touches the yellow is the border that separates what we perceive as reality and the supernatural. We received our ideas from someplace beyond ourselves. The supernatural, what we bring to fruition, is a reflection of our experience. Now, I want to close with an example of exploring narratives that I drew upon in my Master of Laws thesis. The central thesis in that document is that I've drawn parallels between the oppression of Indigenous laws and the oppression of the laws that come from the supernatural beings, and that has followed the same path of the oppression of Haida Kill and Hot Kill, the Haida language. The supernatural realm needs to take its rightful place in our decolonized minds. So in my thesis, I review narratives that our ancestors told at the turn of the century. One of them is Nang Ichtingas Gira Dagagan, the man with the fish trap. It illustrates the application of the laws of allocation and Yakudam in allocating salmon between humans and bears. So in this story, a man made a fish trap in a creek that was within his territory. He caught many salmon with that fish trap. He used yellow cedar limbs to string together so that the salmon would be caught. He took them home. No one else was catching salmon, so he gifted the salmon, as we do, to those in the community and in his clan. The next day he went back, but the trap did not have any salmon in it because it had a hole. He repaired it and went home without any salmon to his people. The next day, the same thing happened. Before repairing it, he looked around to see what had happened, and he saw bear tracks in the earth. And he got angry at the bears, and he yelled an insult at them. How those eaters of raw flesh break through my fish trap. He repaired his fish trap, said more insults to the bears, and went home. The following day, when he went back to the fish trap, two handsome men greeted him. They wore bearskin blankets and had black cheeks. They invited him to their home, saying, "We come from a very good town. Come with us." And so he walked really far with them, with a clear trail into the inland of Haida Gwaii until they reached a lake. And across the lake, he saw many fires, and it was described as smoke like a comb because there were so many houses and so much thick smoke from the fires. Those across the town came to them in their canoe. They invited him into the house, and the chief roasted salmon from them. And they took a piece of that roasted salmon and said, put it on his heart and said, do you feel it? You who said that we eat raw things. He ate what they fed him, and at night the bear people hunted for more food for their chief. When the bear people returned, they took off their bear skins. As we know, beings are able to transform by removing their cloaks, and they became human. And when they were away, the woman that I talked about, Haida Gwaii, half-rock woman, told the man how to build a fire with wet wood, and so that the fire wouldn't go out when they came home and shook their fur, and gave him supernatural things to escape the bear village with. He lived with them all winter. One day the bear chief bathed and had him look after his bear skin while he took a bath. He ran away with the chief's bear skin. The bear people started chasing him, and he escaped using the gifts that he got from Haida Gwaii. He threw hair clippings on the ground, and those hair clippings became trees that were difficult for the bear people to get through. He got far ahead of them because of that. When they came close again, he put water down from which a large lake formed, and they had difficulty going around the lake. He did this 2 times and got far enough that he was able to reach his canoe. As he pulled away in his canoe, he saw the chief bear running out of the forest in human form, but without the bear skin coming into the realm of the humans. His body melted, and the skin that he had in his canoe filled with the body of the bear. The man returned home. The townspeople were so happy to see him. He'd been gone for so long. He fed them all bear meat. He fed them the bear chief. And soon afterwards, they received news that the black bear people, the grizzly bear people, as is shown here in Robert's art, the beaver people, the wolf people, the deer people, had declared war on the human beings. The townspeople built a 10-row stockade around their town to protect themselves. The bears pulled down the stockades with their teeth, and the humans killed the animals with arrows. When all the animals reached the last stockade, they retreated. They did not kill the humans. There were too many dead animals for the humans to eat, and the meat was all wasted. This narrative has many lessons for us as humans. The man failed to recognize that he was supposed to share the salmon with the bear people, and that the stream did not only belong to human beings. His failure to share his insults and his disrespect to the bear people, especially because he was using a fish trap that increased his ability to catch salmon, that was even more of a wrong that he committed. The bear people took him away to teach him how his words were wrong and to teach him how to share wealth. The bear chief trusted him, but he breached that trust and stole the bear chief's skin. As in the way of our animal relatives, the bear skin was how they transformed between the realms. The bear breached that trust by eating the bear chief with the townspeople without showing proper respect to the bear before taking his life. These disrespectful acts undermined the natural order between the forest people and the human beings and led to the animals declaring war on humans. The forest people were no match for arrows. The war was devastating for them. This narrative emphasizes our responsibility as humans to protect the forest people, those who cannot defend their territories from the actions of humans. Breaking that responsibility had further consequences for the humans. The ability of humans to survive depends upon an agreement between humans and the forest people, whereby the forest people, or the salmon people, and all the peoples around us agree to give up their lives to us humans in exchange for respect and care. Breaking that agreement with the natural world threatened the existence of humans. The humans killed too many animals and the food was wasted, thereby further disrespecting the forest people. Ultimately, the humans threatened their own food sources. So we learn that fundamental breaches of the Yahkudan legal tradition threatens human existence, and that's the problem that we're facing with the climate crisis and the energy solutions that we're trying to find. So this has lessons for us as we consider renewable energy. we are threatening our own food sources. We have a responsibility to protect our food sources under Haida Law. Now, I'm going to end with my depiction of our conception of Haida Gwaii. Many of us know this narrative. Before the time of the human beings, the supernatural beings had a battle for the privilege, not the onus, but the privilege of holding up Haida Gwaii. Kuya was the victor. He won, and therefore he gained the privilege of holding up Haida Gwaii. The Haida word for responsibility we heard earlier, Lalaxaaygans, translates literally as you on it, chest leaning on. In other words, responsibilities are felt in our chest and in our heart. I interpret the source of this conception of the word responsibility, of the law of responsibility, to come from the battle of those supernatural beings at the beginning of our time. SGaanaGwaay teaches that the responsibility to protect and take care of the community is founded in the love for the community, and it is willingly assumed rather than out of a sense of obligation. We're not all here because we have to be here. We're here because we want to be here, and we want to find a solution together. Cherokee scholar Jeff Korntassel encourages Indigenous peoples to renew our roles and responsibilities with our communities. This is a responsibility-based relationship with our homelands, with Haida Gwaii, this place that all of us are now calling home. This responsibility requires us to use all the tools to ensure our survival: litigation, negotiation, renewing our laws, upholding our laws, working together with all the communities so that we can train our young people for the challenges ahead. Thank you. Hawa.